Have you found yourself isolated and alone in a crumbling manor house? Is the landscape outside sombre and desolate and the weather perhaps a little dreary? Do you feel a sense of unease creeping over your shoulder, and are there unanswerable mysteries behind every door? If so, you may have just found yourself in a Gothic novel. So the Gothic literature genre is a fascinating one because I feel as though it continuously reinvents itself whilst also honouring its origins. It takes on new shape and new form with every century. Now, the first supposed Gothic novel per se that was dubbed as such was The Castle of Otranto, which was first published in 1764, though of course it owes many of its own sort of origins to the inspirational material that came before it, and the term Gothic long predates its existence within literature, as originally it was a term used to describe an architectural style. So you've probably encountered some Gothic architecture in your life, whether in pictures or in person, and it, you know, casts quite a shadow. It's quite imposing a style, it's intricate, it's detailed, it's dark, it's broody, and again it's inspired many like reinventions of that style in the centuries since. Whatever the reason and whatever the art form, it seems as though Gothic has a hold on us. It never fades into the background, or at least if it is in the background, it's that shadowy presence making sure you're aware it's definitely still there. In terms of literature, that can take the form of straightforward horror novels, ghost stories. Again, you often see the presence of that creepy isolated house. We often have a naive young protagonist who maybe has the best of hopes for the story but doesn't know what they're getting themselves in for. But equally, the mystery or even the romantic sensibilities of Gothic can come to the fore. And all of those things I think are why so many people are drawn to the Gothic, because it sort of balances that romanticism and darkness simultaneously, whether or not we should or shouldn't. And some of the books I'm going to talk about in this video definitely explore that contrast in the Gothic literature genre. And though of course there are many classic Gothics out there, some incredible Gothic literature that's come before, including Gothic literature that is self-referential and in fact satirises its own genre, like Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen, I more often than not find myself drawn to the modern Gothic. There's something so fascinating to me about the modern Gothic in the way that it explores and subverts Gothic of the past. So I wanted to sit down with you today and talk about some of my favourite modern Gothic novels, or novels I would consider modern Gothics in one way or another, and hopefully, you know, maybe get some more recommendations from you in exchange. I love this back and forth when we can share recommendations. So without further ado, let's get into my favourite modern Gothic. So a Gothic novel I read just last year, I believe it was Bluebeard's Castle by Anna Biller. Now, what I found particularly compelling about this novel is that it is so overt about its relationship to the Gothic genre and Gothic literature and Gothic history in its own story, and it's taking that overtness in order to subvert it. And we actually have a protagonist in this novel who is a Gothic writer. So it's set in the contemporary day, although it has this sort of almost timelessness to it. Like, it almost feels like it could be taking place 100 years ago, 50 years ago, or today, but I think it is explicitly today. And our novelist is a woman who doesn't have a lot of romantic experience of her own. She comes from a very wealthy background and she loves to write, and she's a very well-known, renowned author of these Gothic romances, but in her own life she hasn't really experienced that kind of passion, that desire, that love that she writes about, until of course she meets a mysterious man at a friend's wedding. Now, fair warning, this novel is not a romance. It is an exploration of our romanticisation of darkness, toxicity and abusive relationships that can happen. And we follow our protagonist as she gets sort of ensnared and roped into this relationship with this mysterious man who, you know, seems perfect, gives her everything she wants in his high moments, and not able to kind of separate herself from it because of her romanticisation of this relationship and how she's certain he'll change and things can get better. And it's a very difficult read, I have to say. It's upsetting but also important, I think, to really get into that mindset and to get into that headspace and explore it from all angles, and it's written in a really beautiful way. I think the prose delivers that contrast between the beauty of the writing and actually the kind of horror of what's going on the page, and you yourself as the reader almost find yourself being lulled into a false sense of security by the love interest. So that's all very interesting. If you haven't read this book before, you may still have heard of the author because she's also the writer behind a sort of cult classic horror film, The Love Witch, which has very iconic visuals that you might have seen before. But for me, this was a very confronting read is what I would call it, but a very compelling one as well. I could not put it down. Now, one of the things that isn't like integral to the Gothic but is a common trope and will come up quite a few times in this video is the place as a character, and particularly those big manors with empty hallways and cold drafts that create this quite like overwhelming isolating setting for the character or characters. And another one in which that is true is The Hacienda by Isabel Cañas. It's set in the aftermath of the 19th century Mexican War for Independence, and it follows a young woman who is looking for a position of safety in her life. Her father was executed during the War of Independence, and her mother don't have much to their names, but they are from more of an aristocratic background, so she accepts a marriage proposal from a man that she believes will keep her safe. It seems like a fair arrangement where everyone's going to rub along quite well, and she goes to his hacienda where she is going to be, of course, the woman of the house, but she is confronted by his sister, who is not happy about her coming here. Her new sister-in-law does not like her. It is very clear off the bat, and I definitely was reminded in part of Guillermo del Toro's Crimson Peaks when I first read this, in that one specific dynamic. But she has to figure out how to muddle along, and it's not just the sister she has to worry about, because it feels as though there may be the lingering presence of her new husband's ex-wife. And it's actually a multiple perspective story, which is told from the perspective of our new bride and from a local priest who is also a witch, or at least he comes from a magical background but has dedicated himself to the priesthood. I also really enjoy the dynamic of the two characters. They come from different backgrounds, but they've both gone through their own struggles, and there's like hints at a possible forbidden romance budding between them, whilst also trying to kind of survive and figure out what's going on. Plus the historical detail really paints quite a like vivid backdrop to the story, and it adds a lot of depth, I think, to have all of that detail regarding the Mexican War of Independence and its aftermath, and that's an important part of the story in itself, actually. If you want to talk about the importance of architecture in Gothic literature, another modern Gothic set in the contemporary era is The Nesting by C.J. Cook, and interestingly enough, the architecture in the house in question in this book is definitely not in a Gothic style. It's in a supremely modern style. It's a very like new house built by like a new modern architect in Scandinavia, and we follow Lex, who has taken a job as a nanny for this wealthy architect and his child. I mean, obviously she's the nanny to the child, but she's taken it under false pretenses. She's pretended she's somebody else, somebody with a very different CV from hers, in order to get away, because she's struggling and her own life isn't in a place where she's comfortable and happy, and she thinks this is a good way to get away, to escape, to kind of start again, to make some money, and to like wash all of the past away. So there's that initial sort of lie that lays the foundations between all of their dynamic, but then there's also the fact that the father is also a widower who recently lost his wife out in this house that they were building together, and she died under mysterious circumstances. So our protagonist is alone, essentially, surrounded by people she doesn't know, with this job in rural Norway in the forests, and there's elements of Norwegian folklore at play. I think in some senses this is a mystery Gothic thriller that also verges on folk horror, and the questions that constantly appear keep you wondering, which I think is really great. And I love the writing style. I've read a few books by C.J. Cook now, and I actually just adore her writing style in general. I wouldn't call it full-blown horror, more of like a mystery thriller with some folk and Gothic elements. Right, Modern Gothic number 4 is one of my favourites. This is a book I talked about recently in my favourite horror novels of all time, but any excuse, and that is The House of Hunger by Alexis Henderson. So this is a more fantastical story, although in saying that, There's not a lot of like pure fantasy magical elements to this book, but it's set in another world which is unidentifiable, although shares a lot in common with our own world historically, and it's divided into two sections. You know, you have the poor, the people who work in the factories, the people who society feeds off of and lives off of and depends on, but who get nothing back, and then you have the wealthy who just lays around being wealthy and greedy and what have you, and they employ blood maidens. So one of the very few ways to get out of one section of society and move up is to become a blood maiden, which means that the rich basically drink your blood. They're not vampires, but they're vampiric, let's be honest. It's definitely a metaphor for the bleeding of capitalism and class division and the blood-sucking nature of the ultra wealthy, which I really enjoy. And our protagonist becomes a blood maiden and she thinks this is her way out, this is her new beginning, but of course it's not the dream she thought it would be. She and her fellow blood maidens have this tense dynamic where they all want to be the favourite of their mistress, but also they're each other's only companions, they're each other's only equals in this society, and they kind of have to find a way to be friends without completely being pitted against one another. And then there's also the dynamic between our protagonist and her mistress, who she loves but is also dependent on, and all of that going on at play, and who can she trust and who can she not trust. Can she survive and thrive in this society, or is there something even darker, more nefarious than simply the fact that she's there to give someone blood? I love our protagonist, who is a survivor, who will fight to survive and get through, and also the metaphor at its heart. Then a book which has the genre in the title, and that is Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia. Gothic, like I said, is literally in the title. Like, you know this one's a Gothic. But it's set in 20th century Mexico when a young woman who is a bit of a socialite, she's independent, she's got money, she needs no husband, goes to visit her sister. So her sister has got married to a man that none of them really know, and they don't know much about his family, but he comes from this wealthy background, and she hasn't been in contact with them in a while, or at least her communications have seemed a little bit off. So our protagonist goes to visit her sister in this big wealthy manor house where this family live, and she learns some of their family secrets, or she has to dig a little to find their family secrets because there's something off about them, and she is of course desperate to protect her sister. I love our protagonist because she is this sort of like fierce independent woman who loves her sister, wants to protect her sister, and isn't going to let any man or society tell her not to. There is a discussion of race in Mexico and colonization going on through the story, and also some really interesting twists and turns with the actual like plot. I don't want to say what happens, but there's some unexpected twists and turns I really enjoy. Okay, so my next book is interesting. It's not supernatural in any way, shape or form, though the kind of like possibility of something ghostly and supernatural is something I think that is common in the Gothic but not required, and certainly not in this case. And it's also different because it does not star a naive, hopeful protagonist thrown into the depths of the mystery, but it completely reverses that, and that is Victorian Psycho by Virginia Fueto. So this novel's interesting because the protagonist is our titular Victorian psycho. She takes on the position as a governess at a wealthy household. She has her own motivations for being there and for taking on this particular position that her employers do not know about, and she slowly sort of becomes a part of their household whilst also acting strangely and making other people uncomfortable and doing things behind the scenes that nobody would have expected. And why I would consider this a play on the Gothic is because we have this young woman who is looking for answers, who finds herself in this big house with these rich people, but she is not the one who is in danger. They are. And I think that's a really fun subversion of one of the most popular Gothic tropes, which is obviously like our naive young bride or a servant who finds herself in one of these manor houses, and she's not a protagonist who you necessarily always sympathise with. She's not meant to be, but she is a really interesting character, and it makes for a really interesting read to follow somebody just given to literally every urge they experience and the dark things that she ends up doing and how the story unfolds from there. It's a dark book, and probably look up some of the content warnings before you go into it, but one that I think once you start you won't be able to put down. Alright, so my next book is a little bit different because it's not so much about one person going to visit a big house. There are other types of Gothic, and that is Melmoth by Sarah Perry. So this is actually a book which is inspired by an earlier novel also known as Melmoth. The original Melmoth the Wanderer was written by Charles Maturin and came out in the 1820s and is about a scholar who sold his soul to the devil. Sarah Perry's Melmoth, however, follows Helen. Well, it actually follows a few different characters, but Helen's our first character, shall we say, who is working as a translator in Prague and comes across these documents that reference a being known as Melmoth. Like I said, however, Helen is not the only character, and actually there are multiple POVs from different time periods throughout. I think they were all in the 20th century. It's been a few years since I read this book, but we have contemporary Helen whilst also having characters from like decades previously. And for all of these characters, no matter what time period you're in, they are sort of haunted by this being of Melmoth, who may or may not exist, but sort of represents the temptation to do things that we shouldn't, and to maybe lead you down a darker path, a bit like making the deal with the devil, and how these people, these characters, kind of make their way in the world, the consequences of their actions and how they deal with things that have happened to them in the past, and also Helen trying to figure out whether or not Melmoth is real. And it's really, really interesting. It was actually a book I read many, many years ago, and now that I'm talking about it, I'm really wanting to reread it because I feel like it would be really interesting to reread. Alright, so next up we have The 13th Tale by Diane Setterfield, which I would call a sort of like literary Gothic mystery which has a dual timeline. So we're actually following a journalist who's going to interview a famous novelist. It's funny how many like contemporary Gothics have a novelist character in them, but this novelist has sort of quite a mysterious past, and there's lots of secrets around her that she's never told anybody, but like this is going to be the tell-all. This is going to be the big reveal in order for this other woman, our narrator, to write her biography. And for that reason we're following the writer who's writing the biography, the journalist in the contemporary time, and then we're also hearing the story of the past from this novelist. And over the course of the novel, our novelist narrates the story of growing up with her twin and their childhood and what happened to them and what they went through and the kind of mysteries that she's been hiding from the world. Like, I can't say much more than that, right, without like giving away the mysteries, but it's a really interesting way to tell a story, this dynamic between the writer who is trying to write the biography and our novelist who is recounting her story in her past. And like our biographer, you're so intrigued by this story and by what happened to her and the secrets that she's been hiding, but you also can't entirely rely on her as a narrator, and you can't entirely trust what she's telling you is true, and it leads you to ask new questions really that you wouldn't have even had before this story began. And it's a very interesting way to tell a story, and a very compelling way to tell a story. I love Diane Setterfield's writing. It is very, very luscious, and I think it goes perfectly with a story that is about writers and writing, because it's so many layers of writing, isn't it, with our writer, with Diane Setterfield, writing about a writer who's writing about a writer. And it works really well, and it's a really, really beautiful, intriguing book. So my next novel is very much a fantasy book. It's the first book in a fantasy trilogy. It's high magic, high fantasy, but it also has a layer of Gothic to it, especially given that it is partly loosely inspired by Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, and that is Tales of a Monstrous Heart by Jennifer Delaney. So in this novel we follow Kat, who's in her early 20s, and she is a fairy in a fantasy world that, again, like sort of has your sort of Victorian sensibilities. It's one of those fantasy books where it's not set in our world, it's not set in a specific time in our world, but mirrors what we might recognise in, say, like a Victorian historical novel, except that it's a fantasy and there's fairies, and everyone knows there's fairies because there was a big war in the past, and society is very much stratified, and fairies are down low on the food chain below like human magicians. But she is part of sort of like a peace pact between their people, so she's been allowed to study at this magic school and this magical university, but she's never really gotten as far as she'd like she doesn't know if she'll ever graduate, because will they let her, given that the council look down on her so much, until she is given a new opportunity to partner up with a very well regarded mage. And this mage is named Emrys, and Emrys lives in a big mysterious magical house full of interesting magical books, and there's so much secrecy and mystery surrounding him. He's a dark brooding character who Kat is immediately drawn to, and they find themselves sort of linked by their fascination with certain aspects of magic and their desires to understand certain facets of their society and to uncover the answers to dangerous things that are happening, but also to uncover answers regarding each other. And it's got a slow burn, like dark broody romance going on in the background, as well as like bigger political machinations. I've only read book 1 and only the first 2 books are out, but I cannot wait to read the sequel. I need to pick it up ASAP. I only just finished the first one. It's really fantastic, whether or not you're a Jane Eyre fan like I am, but it's fun to see where it does pull inspiration from that classic sort of semi-gothic novel, and I loved it. It was a fantastic read. Okay, last but not least, mainly because my camera battery thing is flashing telling me it's time to stop filming. And that is The Strange Case of the Alchemist's Daughter by Theodora Goss. This is the first in another supernatural paranormal fantasy series. I'm never quite sure where the line is between paranormal and fantasy, if I'm being perfectly honest, but one which is directly inspired by a number of classic spooky gothic stories from the literary canon. So what I love about this book is that it brings together so many recognisable names. We're talking inspiration from Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Sherlock Holmes, which isn't necessarily in itself gothic, but like can be brought in there, Rappaccini's Daughter, The Island of Dr. Moreau, Frankenstein, Dracula, etc, etc, and so on and so forth. Carmilla. Actually, I'm just like remembering more as I go along, and I've only read the first 2 books in the series so far. And what Goss does in her approach to these classics is to sort of examine the experiences and the purpose of the sort of neglected women in these stories, the women who are used and abused by their fathers, partners or creators, and thus we get a collection of daughters who may or may not be like the biological daughters of these men. Moreau's is his creation, but Moreau and Frankenstein create their daughters, you know, Jekyll just has one, etc, and they slowly find one another because of the link between their fathers, because it turns out their fathers are all part of the same sort of society where they are so obsessed with like the science of the 1800s and the Victorian era and like finding answers, but they do not care about the women that they step over and misuse in order to find their answers. And these women come together to basically take them down. And it's so much fun. Like, it has that nostalgia for anybody who loves those classics. It kind of takes inspiration from the literature of the Victorian era to do something kind of subversive for a modern audience, and I love it. I love the historical setting, I love the characters, I love their found family and friendship, and just following all of the mysteries and twists and turns of the series. I really need to get to book 3 because I loved books 1 and 2, and I don't know if there's going to be new characters and books explored in book 3 that I haven't come across yet, so that is definitely on the TBR. But those are some of my favourite modern gothics, modern novels that I think explore classic gothic themes, that maybe subvert them, do something different, but whilst also like honouring a time-old beloved subgenre. So let me know if you have any more recommendations for classic or modern gothics. What tropes in particular do you enjoy in your gothic? What draws you to the gothic genre? And until next time, happy reading. I'll see you all again soon. Bye everyone!